The Christian Association for Survivors of Suicide Loss is pleased to present our podcast, Reaching for Hope with Joy Osborne. Let's join Joy and her guests as they discuss topics of relevance for emotional and spiritual wellness.
Welcome, everyone, to our podcast today. I've got Lloyd, Diana, and Kelsey with me, and today we're going to be talking about boundaries. You may not understand what a boundary is. I know for me, I didn't understand this until recently. And I'm going to be using examples and some definitions from Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. They've written a lot of books on boundaries. So if you need information on that, we'll have some of their videos, podcast, and materials out on our site. So what is a boundary? I like what Dr. Townsend and Dr. Cloud mentioned. They use an example of your property. It's like a property line, and you have your house, and everything in your property is yours, and you decide what you want in or to come in to your property or even in your home. So if you think about it, it's like an invisible line that keeps us physically and emotionally safe. So we want to talk about this today because many people don't understand boundaries, and if they understood them more and established boundaries, we feel that would be a key. So in a nutshell, boundaries are the key to relationships. So we're going to be discussing different types of boundaries today on the podcast. So the first one we'd love to talk about is marriage. So guys, have you ever established boundaries in marriage? And if so, I'd love to hear how you did. If you didn't, and you learned later on, what were some ways that you established those boundaries, and why did you establish them?
Well, I guess I'll go.
Okay, Diana.
Let's see. I've had to. You know, there was something going on in our marriage that was not healthy, and it came to a point that it was really hurting me physically and emotionally. I mean, I was internalizing all that. I actually learned that from going to a meeting. So from being with other people, seeking help, I learned about those boundaries. So somebody said that to me. They recommended, and I was seeing things that I said they were either black or white. So, and during this meeting, somebody asked me, could there be, instead of black or white, the way you're seeing it, could there be a gray area? And I decided to explore that gray area. What would that look like? Because at this point, I was thinking either I have to put up with this for the rest of my life and be miserable, or I have to divorce. And I didn't want either or. Right. So in my case, I had to explore what that gray area was. And that was setting those boundaries, the things that I was not willing to accept, and clearly communicating what that person needed to do in order for us to have that healthy relationship. And at that point, they needed help. And they had to seek their healing, and I had to seek mine. And that worked out very well for us. But I needed outside help.
Oh, that's good. Yep. Yeah. And God brings people in our lives to help us. I think that's
absolutely
a great point. Anybody else have any in their marriage that they want to share?
I was going to say marriage is a difficult one because there's a lot of compromise, and there's a lot of talking so you can figure out what works best for each person. And like you said, it's just not always black and white. So, you know, it has to be a lot of communication for the partners to figure out, okay, what's going to work. I think there's some things obviously that are like, okay, this, you know, we're not going to do this, but, you know, smaller things that you live with in your daily life, I feel like you just got to find a way to make it work for both of you.
Right.
You just reminded me of something because my husband and I served in the military. And, you know, something that you do have in the military is those rules of engagement. And we got married at 17.
Wow.
And
That's young.
Very young. I don't recommend it. But because we were still children. However, from even at that age, even being that immature, we set those rules of engagement. And without even knowing, now that I'm talking about it, I didn't realize that those were boundaries. There were things that we will never do this. Like
Yeah,
even
yeah,
early
yeah.
on in our marriage,
Yeah.
like we will never be disrespectful to each other. We will never curse at each other.
Yeah.
We will never be physical with each other.
Nice.
And those were those rules of engagement that never changed.
Yeah, I think early on it's important to have those core boundaries.
That's good, Lloyd. That's good. That's really good. You know, Diana, I wanted to ask you, when you and your husband, I know at 17 and you're still together, and that's really a God thing. I really,
Yes,
you know.
definitely.
So it sounded like he agreed to it. So that's another one of those things that we have to make sure we communicate what we want and that the other person agrees to it. So it sounds like he did.
Absolutely. You both. Communication is the key.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to share a little bit, probably more personal for me, and this is the marriage boundaries. And my first marriage, my first husband passed away, but in my marriage, I had to establish boundaries that were not easy to put in place. All right. So I will share a little bit here about that. I'm not disrespecting him. I'm trying to bring light to things because I think maybe people or some people who are listening might be going through some of the similar things that I experienced. My first husband had a lot of chronic pain. He had PTSD. He was a vet. He got injured while not deployed in active, but it was in active duty, but he still got injured in the military. And with that came chronic pain. And he also was put on some opiates that he eventually got addicted to. All right, so there might be some people out there who are running into the same type situation. And I had to learn a lot through that. And I had to establish some boundaries, a lot of boundaries, if I might be honest and real with everybody, is because if anybody's ever lived through a situation where somebody's addicted and they're trying to overcome, you've got to have boundaries in place. And what I mean by that is, for me, spending money, because if you're addicted to anything, you're 10 to 1, they're going to want to get more and they need money. So we had to establish some boundaries. Now, did that go well? Did he agree at the time? He agreed, but the addiction played a different story. It played out a little bit differently there. So I had to do some things, and we'll be talking more about this in our other podcasts, but I want to bring it up now because, like I said, I think others might have gone through this or are going through it, but I had to make sure that financially I was setting the boundary of that I would control the money, and he did agree to that, but it also caused a little bit of problems. So I had to go get other people, like you said, Diana. I had to go get help from other people to help me navigate that, to have a accountability, if you will, and help with making sure we kept those boundaries. Now, sometimes that boundary was crossed. And the important thing about boundaries is once you establish them, you got to stick with them. Now, sometimes you have to reevaluate them. Did that really make sense? Is that going to be doable? Right? And then sometimes you might have to revise the boundary. But in my case, when it came to financial, there was no changing that boundary because otherwise I wouldn't have anything, right? So I had to, and there's times it was not pleasant, I'll just say. And that's why if somebody is running into this and they don't feel safe, you might have to have a backup plan as to what to do. For me, I had to go seek help somewhere to stay for a little while until we could stabilize that situation. So financial was one. And because you're physical, like we said in the definition of boundaries, it's not just emotional boundaries where you're setting it so you're safe emotionally, but it's also physical boundaries. If you're not safe, you need to have a backup plan. You need to have a way that you do feel safe. And I know for me at the time, I didn't want to tell anybody about that boundary being crossed and that it was so uncomfortable. So I went to a shelter. So there are places you can go. I didn't stay with friends. I didn't want anybody knowing my business. And that's another thing we have to be careful with as well, is making sure you have other people that you can go to, that you can talk to about that. So that is one area where I had to set a boundary. It wasn't pleasant. I stuck to it. Yes, it didn't turn out exactly what I want, the way I wanted all the time, but I also had to make sure that I stayed true to the boundary. And sometimes that's uncomfortable. Sometimes those discussions are not easy, but it's for your safety. So we've been talking about boundaries. And so does anybody have an example of how you implemented a boundary?
So I've been married for a little over 3 years, so still very heavily in the creating boundaries era of our marriage, I believe. Although, as you said before, boundaries are obviously revised and renewed. You find new ones. So there's been a lot of that for sure. But one specifically that we started to talk about before we even got married was finances. Finances seem to be a really big one for sure in marriage.
Yeah.
Specifically, how we were going to split things up. We decided to put our money all together. So we did have to find boundaries for what we could spend and be okay with. So specifically, we did come up with rules like, oh, this is the exact dollar amount that each of us could spend without consulting each other or saying anything.
That's great.
And I'll say at the beginning, I think that amount was quite low because we were both learning to see where we're at with finances, kind of just exploring how that looks. And I will say, as the years have gone by, we keep revising that as the trust builds. So I'd say that's a good example of an early boundary that we set that continues to be revised even to this day.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, yeah, that's really good. Very important for marriage, I think. Finances, like you said, is just always a big factor. I was gonna say a big issue, but I don't think it's a problem. It's just a big thing that you need to ensure that you're dealing with. So setting boundaries, I think, is important. I would say my example is setting boundaries for work is so important. So important, especially for your mental health. I did a lot of recruiting and admin for my previous job. The hours, well, it was salary, so the hours was like, whenever needed. And it was just terrible because for a short time, I think about 3 to 6 months or so, I was working pretty much 7 to 12 at night or something like that. And I didn't, take a whole bunch of breaks. Sleep really wasn't there anymore. There's a lot of different things that I should have been doing that I was not. I don't want to say like I didn't care about myself enough, but I guess that's what it is, really. I feel like when you set boundaries, you're showing and telling yourself and the people around you that, I care about me enough to ensure that I'm mentally okay.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, if you do that for a period of time, you're not going to be able to function at all. So then what's the point of doing it? You got to make sure that you set boundaries for your lunch and for breaks and when you're off the clock and you want to do some personal stuff, you go ahead and do that, because I feel like that helps you to maintain your productivity.
Yeah, it's true. Did it also impact your marriage?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You need that time to spend with your wife and with your spouse. So that's very important. It can't always be about work.
Right.
Yeah.
And if anyone's like me, sometimes you want to make sure like things are done and you want to, do it to perfection. So it can be kind of like, I feel like you're going against yourself to create those boundaries and space for yourself, but it's so important.
Yeah.
Right. That's good. Yeah, I know for me, I was a workaholic for many years. I felt that's what I needed to do. I was so driven, and therefore I wasn't at home a lot either. And it did impact me physically. I started having leg pains and stuff because I was sitting so long, and self-care is very important.
Yes.
When we don't have those boundaries, that definitely becomes a problem.
I think that sometimes we see boundaries maybe in a negative we have like a negative connotation about that. When like at the beginning you started saying that boundaries are physical or emotional or mental. I think we tend to look at boundaries from a negative perspective. And like Joy was saying, boundaries are, if we switch the perspective, it's a sense of protection. It's like a fence right off a cliff, and we're like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, but instead is this protection to prevent us from going over the cliff. And like you said, it could be physical, mentally, emotionally, and like we just had some great examples of marriage, financial, and work. And sometimes it's difficult for us to set those boundaries because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. But if we look at it, then in return, we're the ones that are hurting ourselves. We become bitter or angry because we haven't set those boundaries. One of the boundaries that I had to set, because I feel like I was just a pleaser, I was saying yes all the time, and I was over my capacity. I was taking in more that I could handle. So I would just be a yes person. And I had to set that boundary of no. And I actually learned that from taking a financial peace university. I had to learn that no was a complete sentence. I'm like, no. And there was no guilt attached to that.
I love that.
So
It's a great example.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's good that you said that, because sometimes people don't know how to set those boundaries. They don't know what to say. And so some examples we might be able to say to people is, this is what I desire, like in a marriage, him talking with each other. And it's not demanding your way, because you can't demand something from somebody who isn't going to agree with you, right? It can say either you do this or I'm leaving. That's not a boundary. That's saying you have to do this in order for, and most people will resist that. So you have to be very careful in the wording that you use, and you want to be respectful.
Yeah.
I know for me, when I was setting boundaries years ago, I prayed and I asked God, when is it appropriate for me to approach this person? And Lord, how do you want me to approach this? Because not everybody can be approached the same way when you're setting a boundary. Like, I wouldn't talk to my husband and set a boundary the same way my boss, right? There are different ways that you approach things, but you have to be honest. You have to be open. You got to be realistic as well in your boundaries, right?
And I like what you said about praying, because then it gives you that discernment, knowing when to say it.
Right. I'd love to know, I always like to know what the Bible says about these topics. And so I know, Kelsey, you had, done some research on this and looked up some things. What did you find?
So I think the best example that I have seen in the Bible about setting boundaries is actually Jesus. He set boundaries all the time, whether it was when he was engaging with the Pharisees or even with his disciples. He was setting boundaries with each and every one of them. And one specific example was actually when Jesus was speaking to a crowd of people. And actually, as you mentioned, the fence on a cliff, it actually is more literal here, that the group of people, after they heard Jesus' message, they try to throw him off of the cliff. Yeah, and they wanted him to prove who he was. And what he actually did, I'll actually read the exact verse. And actually in the English Standard Version, Luke 4:28-30, it says, "When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath. And they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so they could throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went away." So he set a boundary by not engaging with these people any longer. He just walked through and left. So I think that's a very important point in the scriptures here, that sometimes you're not going to be able to make peace with people right then and there because they're not going to engage with you that way. So sometimes you just need to walk away from the situation.
That's really good.
Yeah.
We could have all used some of that.
Yes, definitely.
Well, and that's a great example. And did you know that there's over 600 boundaries in the Bible?
What?
Wow.
Yeah.
No.
See, in our world today, we don't think of boundaries. That word isn't used a lot. And that's probably when people are listening, they're like, well, what's a boundary? And I'm glad we are, explain what that is. But yeah, there's a lot of them, especially in the law and the prophets. There was a lot of things they had. You can't do this, you can't eat that, whatever. And it was for our protection, right? And Jesus wants us to be safe. And I love the verse in the Bible that says to guard your heart. So we can even say that boundaries are a form of guarding oneself, so that you're not allowing certain things in, and you're protecting yourself. Thinking of it that way would be, okay, God, show me. Maybe you're listening and you don't know, Lord, I know I have to establish something. Help me and show me how to implement and put up boundaries where you want me to, that are healthy for me.
Yeah. And I think it really just comes down to, this is also in the Bible, that why are we trying to win the approval of humans and people? We should be going after the approval of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of our boundaries should come off of trying to please God. And yes, we want to be kind and considerate of others, but truly God is what matters above all.
Right.
Yeah.
I think what Joy, you mentioned earlier about the need for community. And when perhaps you've grown up without having those boundaries or not knowing what, boundaries look like, healthy boundaries look like, maybe you need that community to point it out and make you aware
Yeah.
that that's not safe or that's not
Right,
healthy.
yeah.
Like something needs to be established here, and allow people with wisdom that have, that have the best interest in you.
Right.
And sometimes that has to be a professional,
Yeah.
outside of your circle.
I agree.
The way I look at stuff like that is kind of in a mathematical equation.
Oh no.
That's how I think with everything mostly. But you've been given a specific amount of a specific set of values, and whether it's marriage, it's work, or it's whatever, you only can plug what those values that you've been given.
Right.
So if you're using the same values, let's say, for example, marriage, you're using the same values to try to get a different result. You're not until you have other values that you can work with. You need to, like you said, you need to find knowledge or a community or something. So you have those values, those tools that you can work with. Now you can input different values into the equation so you can get a different result.
Right. That's good.
If that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, that does make sense, especially as a teenager and even a young adult, even to now, really. I never really thought of boundaries too much because I don't think people talk about them a whole lot. And I don't even know how I got this view, but sometimes boundaries felt wrong or unkind because people would point out verses in the Bible, even just as forgive, and they just leave it at that.
Right.
They don't say you can forgive and set a boundary all the time. I don't think people make that quite clear, because I've had situations in my life where I've had to deal with people who were mentally harming me. And I felt like I had to just keep letting them do that to me because of the relationship that we had. But I didn't realize until really a few years ago, or even less, that I can still keep that person in my life because of the type of relationship we have, but I can say no to certain things.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to go back to, Diana, what you said about maybe some people grow up without boundaries. And I know I ran into that in some of my relationships, and I had to talk to them and say things like, this is why we can't do this. It's because it causes pain here. Or we are to the point where you're explaining it to them so it makes sense. And it may take more than one time saying it. Say, hey, we agreed to this boundary. And if you step over it again, I'm going to have to, and then you fill in the blank. Maybe I'm going to have to take, leave, or I don't mean leave your spouse, but I can't stay in this because it is not healthy for me, or a relationship. And I don't know if you guys have run into anything like that where you've had to really stand firm. I know, Kelsey, you just did, but when people don't know what boundaries are and they're stepping all over your boundaries, you've got to keep saying, hey guys, we agreed. This is not what we would do, and this is because of, you got to explain it, not just set it.
Joy, you just made me think that a lot of times we have to be careful, because a lot of times we tend to make assumptions that people know.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
And we
that's
have
true.
we have to be communicating that,
Right.
because I may assume like this is common sense or this is obvious because maybe I've set that boundary before, or I grew up like that.
Right.
So I would encourage people to clearly communicate, and not to make those assumptions that somebody else knows what your boundaries are.
right.
They won't know unless you tell them.
That's true.
I think you can create a healthier relationship with that person by setting boundaries.
I agree. So we talk a lot about like work and marriage. What about children? What can we say maybe as we were children? I know, Kelsey, you already brought up you didn't know what boundaries were and things like that growing up. I certainly didn't know what that word was until, a few years ago about boundaries. So with children, though, there's got to be boundaries. Do you guys have any experience, maybe from your own experience, where boundaries were set and they weren't realistic and you had to talk through them, or you had to establish boundaries with your children?
I think my mom set a lot of boundaries for me. And clearly I did not like them growing up.
Why is that?
Because it's like you feel like they're restrictive. You feel like a boundary is somebody not letting you do what you want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. It's the flesh screaming out, "I want to do this," and somebody's going to tell me no. How dare you?
Especially a parent.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, it's like, how do you, it's your perspective. How do you see boundaries? Do you see it as a list of do nots? Or do you see it as a fence of protection, like you were saying with our own property? Why do I have a fence?
Right.
To protect my property, to set, those guidelines, right? So it's how we see it. So I saw it as like, she doesn't want me to do this or that. Growing up and then becoming a parent, I was like, I'm so glad that she did, because of the discipline and the character that it developed.
Right.
I didn't realize it until I was an adult,
Right.
that she was protecting me. And I didn't do many of the things that my friends did because of that. And I'm glad, because I ended up in a better place.
That's good.
So,
Yes.
and then the funny part is like all the things that you hated, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do it with my kids.
Yeah.
Because I guess I saw the result in me, as I'm like, I'm going to do this. I will use this. I mean, of course, there are some things that I'm like, no, that's not necessary.
Right.
But definitely setting some boundaries. Something as simple as like curfews. You're going to be home at this time. Taking their cell phones away.
Right. Social media is a big one. Yeah.
Social media, no, you will not. Like, for example, in our family, we do not allow cell phones during dinner time. We eat dinner time as a family, and there's absolutely nobody can be on their phones.
Yeah.
And we actually take I would say technology Sabbath on Sundays. Like, we don't use any technology.
I like that.
So those are some I guess some boundaries that we can use.
Yeah.
And what we say goes as parents, with that loving and communication.
Right.
And as when my kids became teenagers, I would have their input. And sometimes I'll be like, okay, what do you think is a good
I like
boundary
that.
to have?
Yeah.
What do you suggest?
Right.
Sometimes they were harder on themselves than I would have been. I'm like, okay.
I think that's good to communicate, even if as a child you may not even fully understand why, even after the communication, because you are a child.
Yeah.
I think that's important. I know specifically as a kid, one of the biggest things that I always felt left out of is that I wasn't allowed to go to many sleepovers unless my parents knew the parents very, very well, knew every single person that was going to be in that house. And as a kid, I had no clue. Even if they tried to explain that it was for our safety, I still didn't know. So I was always very upset about that as a child. But then as I've gotten older and seen some of the horrific things that can happen at sleepovers, I'm to the point where I think I could be even more strict, maybe just never let my kids go to sleepover ever. I don't know. Some of those things that you just had as a child, you don't understand until you get a little bit older, I think.
As a child, like you said, you may not understand like why the boundaries are being set, but when you get older, then you're like, oh, that makes sense. And I think by having those boundaries when you're a child, you can create boundaries of your own when you're an adult. And I just think it's very important, and it definitely helped.
Yeah, I've read years ago, and I don't know if it was James Dobson or somebody else that said kids really, or maybe it was a psychiatry book or psychology book or something like that, kids really want to be disciplined. They just don't realize it. And just like you guys are saying, because they set boundaries with you to help to keep you safe.
Yeah.
Now you're seeing it. So those of you who are listening out there, maybe young kids who don't understand why parents are setting these boundaries for you, just know that later on in life you'll look back and see that, you know what, they were teaching you something very important to keep you safe physically and emotionally.
Yeah, yeah.
I think one of the biggest rewards of those boundaries is trust. I've seen it with my children. When I have set those boundaries and they have respected those, then I give them more trust.
That's great. That is really great.
So I've actually had situations where some of my friends didn't have many boundaries set at all. And as Joy said, that kids do want some sort of boundaries because it actually makes them feel safer and more secure.
Right.
With them not having boundaries, they kind of felt like their parents didn't really care about them.
Yeah.
Because they saw other parents setting those boundaries for other children. And even though those children might think it's unfair, the opposite of having none at all, they just feel less secure, less safe, and less loved.
It's ironic because I've heard that. Like a lot of kids who didn't have boundaries are saying, I wish I did.
Yeah.
The ones that have it, I'm like, I wish I didn't.
Yeah, because for some friends, they had things happen to them or circumstances they wish never did if their parents had just stepped in for them as they should have.
Right, right. Well, friends, with that, we come to the end of part 1 of our discussion on boundaries. We hope you will join us next month for the conclusion of this topic.
Thank you for listening. For more information, visit www.suicideloss.org. That's suicideloss.org. This presentation was not intended as a substitute for professional care. Please see a counselor or physician for your individual needs. Subscribe and like so that you never miss an episode.